Well, hey there folks. Thanks for tuning in to our brand new video tutorial on our new bag design, the Little Bunny Backpack. This is a very cute design and a fun project to stitch out. This video tutorial was a joint effort. Jung In stitched out the Little Bunny Backpack and filmed it. And then our expert in sewing, Martin Smith, has done a voiceover. So there's plenty of instructional gold and helpful tips to help you complete your very own Little Bunny Backpack project. I highly recommend you also follow the photograph written instructions that we provide with your purchase in conjunction with this video tutorial for your best result. If you found this video tutorial helpful, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this video a like. Without further ado, here is the video tutorial on the Little Bunny Backpack.
Let's put together the Little Bunny Backpack. Lay out your pieces and then grab your back two pieces and we're going to join them together across the horizontal line. We're using PU here, so it's a little bit sticky in places. We want to make sure that our lines sit on top of each other and that our seams finish in the same place and that we sew just inside the perimeter stitching line of each of the blocks. We're just using a standard foot because we've got cutaway stabilizer on either side of the block so it won't stick to the machine. Checking to make sure our lines are sitting on top of each other. And stitching to just 2 millimeters to the left hand side of the stitching line that's already there. Let's press this seam open, and because it's PU we're using a pressing mat, which is our Essentials applique pressing mat. Plenty of heat, and then return to the right side and press that seam again. To set the seam, place the hot seam onto a cold surface and those seam allowances will stay open. So we do the same thing for the back. Now we're going to join our exterior gusset, which will be side panels, then to the base, and then a side panel. You'll find that the side panels have got our little arms hanging out of the flip and fold seam. And we get the same manner, we're going to stitch just inside the perimeter stitching line 1 or 2 millimeters. And let's stitch those together and press those seams open. There we have it. Same method as with the front and the back. Pressing cloth over top of the PU seam, open the seam out, apply some heat. If you don't have one of these mats, you can use a baking sheet, or you can even just use an off-cut of fabric. Something to protect the PU so the iron does not touch the PU surface, otherwise it will melt and mark. Now we've got these pieces joined together, we need to cut out our linings. So the top zip panel has already been lined, but the joined gusset that goes around the outside edge of this little bag and the front and back pieces need to have a lining which is exactly the same shape. So pin it together and then cut out around the edge, using the joined panels as a pattern. So these pattern pieces are all symmetrical. So it doesn't really matter that the lining fabric or the backing fabric is facing up. Normally it would be wrong sides together or right sides together. So you've got a pattern piece which represented what it was sitting against, especially if it was an asymmetric design, but these pattern pieces are all symmetrical, so it does not really matter. Right, so we have a matching piece to each of the outside pieces. What we want to do is put seam on seam. We want to clip a mark at the fold of these pieces to indicate the center at the top and the center at the bottom. Very important that we do that on all pieces, so as we've got a good system of balance when we're actually stitching this together. You don't have to cut a little V-notch out of, it's just easier to see on a video. So seam on seam, and at the fold we make a snip. So again, we want to fold our joined gusset section. So at the base panel, we want to find the center on both sides. We were being a bit stingy with our PU, so therefore you'll find that you'll see our stabilizer coming through to the front there. It does not matter, it's caught well within the seams. Let's transfer our markings. So we need to transfer our center notches top and bottom. And also mark where that seam is, because that's going to be a balance point and a marking point for when we put our gusset on. It's very important that we do actually have that mark on our lining, just so as we know where our lining is going to actually stitch to. Do the same for the other piece. And for our lining. So we're going to mark the centers and also at that flip and fold seam where the green goes on to the blue, we want to make a mark there as well, because that's going to stitch to the mark we put on the side of the front and back lining pieces. Alright, let's do our placement for our loops on the back of the back section, so that we've got the loops that have the carriers for the straps already on the top. So in the bottom we want to make sure that they are about 3 inches apart and that they're evenly placed each side of the center mark. So you can already see why we have a center mark. Now the same for our little legs, they're going to be 1 inch apart, so half an inch in from the notch. And we're going to stitch these just inside the seam allowance of the bag, just to hold them into position. Having them clipped or pinned into position is not really sufficient. We want them to be actually in their position quite firmly before we start our work. We'll do the same with the little legs at the bottom. So they are anchored to the seam. Now let's work with our ears. We need to fold them in a good half an inch so as they slightly overlap, and then we need to actually just stitch across them so as they stay closed. It gives the ears some sort of 3 dimensions, so they're just not flat and floppy. They will actually stand slightly. Now we're making a pair, so if the first one was right over left, the second one will be left over right. Doesn't matter which way we do it as long as we're consistent. And we're marking them, we're setting them out about an inch from the end of the marker stitching or in the middle of the marker stitching. It really is just personal preference. There's nothing in particular. We don't want them to butt together side by side, but we want to have them a bit of a gap. So it looks like about an inch in from the end of the marking stitching for the ears. And it's right sides up here, because when we put our gusset on, we still want to be able to look inside the ear, otherwise we won't see all that detail. So they slightly cross, ever so slightly. Now, with our zip panel, which we've already made, it's right sides together, so right sides of the gusset to the actual working side of the zip. And sew those seams together like we did with the gusset seams. This seam's not going to be opened out. This is going to be laying all one way. It's going to be laying away from the zip. So it'll be sitting, pointing down into the bag, and the lining will be attached to it at the next stage. So let's put our first side on. So it is the flip and fold line on our gusset matches our seam on the back, and we want to mark center to center. Again, the flip and fold seam onto the stitch seam of the back. We're just using some quilt clips to attach these layers together rather than pins. Then we want to make sure that we've got centre mark at the top to centre mark of the zip gusset. What we're going to do is just sew the straight seam. So when I say the straight seam, don't sew around the curve. Where the curve plateaus out onto a straight seam, we want to sew these sections first. So bottom and the sides and the top will all have a section sewn already for us to deal with our curved corners as our next step. Don't do it all in one, do it in sections. It just makes it easier to stitch the gusset onto the curve of the back or front pieces of this little bunny bag or bunny backpack. We do want to have seam on seam. Okay, there we go. So it's just the straight sections. And we're following that from having the joined panels uppermost and the gusset with the zip in it on the underside. So centre on centre here. That's slightly curved all the way around, so there's no straight section on this. So, but centre on centre, we've got those marks there. Let's put a clip in. PU is a little bit hard to manipulate sometimes when you're trying to get it sitting all together. So we're just going to sew a small section. It'll be like a couple of inches. Just to get that centre on top of centre. Okay, so that's in position, and now we're going to finish the curved corners and attach the rest of those seams. So we've got straight section done. So seam on seam. Open that seam out on the gusset. Best to work from that gusset side up. And snip every 3/8 to half an inch along the curved area. Well, along the area which is going to sew to the curve. Then we can actually fan and spread that seam out. See it spreading out, opening up. We're not clipping all the way to the stitching. We're clipping just back from the stitching, 3 or 4 mils, or an eighth of an inch, a decent eighth of an inch away. And then that released seam allowance then fans out and allows us to stitch around that curve more confidently. We're stopping and lifting the foot over that PU because it's sticking to the bottom of the foot slightly. A little bit difficult to use. Probably should have used a Teflon foot or a glide foot. Walking foot might be a little bit wide. Here we go, got our first curve done. First corner done. Next corner. So, snip, snip, snip. Spread. Try and push those seam allowances so they're sitting out raw edge to raw edge. Sometimes if the corner is a bit tight that will want to pull back, but do your best. Here we have PU on PU, so it's both seams are slightly fighting each other for supremacy. And we're stitching just to the left-hand side of the original perimeter stitching line, hopefully with seam on seam to give us a lovely curve. If we don't quite get it, it's okay, the seam will still look good in the corners. And we just want to trim that seam allowance back to a 1/4 of an inch, just around that curve so as it sits out a little bit easier. Right, now that top edge, now we need to do our clip, clip, clip. Now these clips are too far apart. You need to be clipping in between these clips, and we did that before we stitched it. See that seam joining the zip to the side panel is facing down, it's not opened out. I think I wandered along here and said need to put some more clips in, which more snips into the gusset. That's fine. The more snips you have in your top gusset seam, the easier it is to actually go around the curve. So you need to sew from the top side so you can actually see what seam you're going to be stitching to. Make sure that seam is facing down. Right, so we've got one seam on. Now we've got one panel on, let's put the other panel on. Again, it's the same process. Centers to centers. Flip and fold seam on the gusset to the open seam on the panel. This one is the front panel. Open seam to fabric flip and fold seam. And we're going to sew these flat sections when we can. This is the first time this lady has actually made one of these bags. Made a bag like this. And it's the first time she's done it with PU as well. And doing very, very well. So just stitching that flat section of that bottom seam, center to center, just making sure those little tabs are sitting flat, seam on top of seam. Tuck that in. Again, snip, snip, snip. Fan the seam out, fan the straight gusset seam out onto the curve. Sew that section around the curve. We're so used to sewing all the way around the edge of something there, so sewing it piecemeal doesn't always feel correct. But it's the best way to deal with something like this that has curves when you're trying to put a flat strip onto a curved area. It's easier to do it in sections, and it makes no difference to the finished product. Right, so she carried on and did exactly the same way. So before putting the lining together, on the gusset length, we're going to stay stitch in 1/2 inch in from the edge, just so as we have a guideline for sewing to actually sew our lining up. Because on the outside panels, we have all the perimeter stitching lines from our embroidery, but on our lining, we have nothing. So we just put in a guideline or stay stitch, you might call it, around the edges of our gusset, so as that we have a guide for sewing and a guide for clipping. Right, it's just the row of stitching that we'll be stitching on the inside of. Before we do anything, we just want to go to the iron and fold over the ends of this gusset just to the 1/2 inch line. So having the stay stitching is actually a really easy way of pressing as well. So we have our little notch, which is going to match on the notch of the side seam of our bag lining. The rounder curve is the top of the bag, the corner curves is the bottom of the bag. So we're going to pin these into position, we're going to pin or clip these into position. And as we get to our curve, we're going to clip around the curve. Notice that we have the gusset up, exactly the same way as we did when we were stitching the outside shell of this little bag, this little backpack. So we just have to clip to the amount of length that will go around our curve. Because you can see, once we get there, see how that spreads open, the little dovetails open up and allow us to put the raw edges together and makes it nice to sew. And then remarkably, we come to the center on center and everything fits. Again, we get to our curve, clip, 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 clip. I like centimetre 3/8 apart for my clipping around a curve more so than 1/2 inch. I like just a little few more clips. And there we go, raw edge to raw edge, fan out that gusset seam, and we're ready to stitch once we get up to the top. And that happens for both sides of putting the lining together, except the other side. On the base seam, you need to leave a gap of about 5 to 6 inches so as we can turn the project through on itself at the very end stages. Okay, so there's our notch matched at the top there, and we've got just the right amount of gusset to fabric. And with a generous 1/2 inch seam, I almost say 5/8 seam, let's stitch out. Then we lose a bit of a bigger seam on our lining so as that they don't seem too gigantic inside the project, because linings always look big inside a bag unless you have reduced the seam allowances. So just by taking an extra 1/8 of an inch when you're stitching your seam makes a world of difference. With curves and straights though, you've got to be very careful how much seam allowance you take, because you can actually end up finding some pleats which really don't matter on a lining. So we're coming up to the end. Keep that press seam down and stitch over the edge of it and reverse securely. Right, so we've got the other side on as well, and you'll see we have left a 6-inch gap at the bottom. Pop your hand through, there we go, that's what we're going to be pulling through. We haven't even pressed this because we don't really need to. That gap is what we're going to pull our project through. Right, let's go to our bag, and it's inside out. So we've got the wrong side out. We want to place the curve, the right side of the lining, to the gusset seam, because that's going to bag that. So we're just going to sew that top crescent out with our lining. So we're going to sew around that curve. So center on center. See, it's so important to keep your center marks visible, because they are your guideline for matching things. Center on center. We don't have to snip the seam because it is quite biased seam because it's a curve. If we get a close-up of this, it's really important for you to see that. We will show you a better picture in a second. Good job, we have lots of clips. Now, if you can see that folded seam of that lining sits on the matching opposing seam. And we're going to be sewing from curve to curve, just where we've got those clipped. We're going to be sewing from that seam, that joining seam there, and we're going to be sewing just on the inside of the perimeter stitching line, following that panel stitching line that's already there, just on the inside of it, keeping it slow and just sewing around the edge of this. And then we'll finish. So just sew into the centre there, and join and carry on to the other half. And so that those two pieces of lining attached to those two half crescents sitting at the top. I'm just going to turn this inside out, pull it through the gap we left in the bottom of the lining, and you'll see that the lining faces out the top curved part of the bag. There's a lot to come out of this bag. You've got ears, and you've got straps and hooks and loops. Just take time. There we go. Looking good. It's such a cute little project. Cute little project. So that top curved panel, front and back, that's what we've just lined with that curved piece of lining. So it's basically around the edges of the zip with that seam further in. That's what we've just stitched. Just making sure that we've got our seams in place. We haven't got any pleats that are too obvious. Happy. We want to actually just sew that seam up. We sewed this one up by hand. I'd probably sew it up by machine because it's much stronger. Do what you wish to do. Right, seam finished. Turn this back inside out because we need to actually just finish the two side lining pieces on the gusset where the zip starts and stops. They haven't been attached yet. Tuck the ears in. So there, we just slip stitch the cross there. If you are a competent machinist, you could actually pin that into place and actually just top stitch in the ditch from the right side through all those layers, catching that piece of lining. We're just going to slip stitch that together, pin that into place. And just slip stitch that with a needle and thread across on both sides of the zip. We don't want our stitches visible from the right side, so we just have to be careful how deep we actually stitch. So we're slip stitching, just picking up the inside lining of that zip gusset, not going all the way through. So that is secured, but as I said before, you could pin that, then turn it through to the right side and machine stitch that seam by stitching in the ditch. If you wish, it would be more secure. It's up to you how you feel about doing that because it will be a little bit fiddly, but on a free arm it should be fine. It's very important to actually control your bag. Tell the bag what you want to do, not what it wants to do. You are in control of making this project. Do the same for the other side. Then we will just need to actually open our zip fully and then turn it through, get any little dags of thread hanging from the inside. Let's turn it through, push our corners out. Push out all our seams. Can roll up a hand towel and add a little bit of heat to the seams to actually make them do what they need to do. Now we're going to, with our straps, which we've pre-made, we're going to thread them through down, then thread up and through the slide buckle, or the slide D-ring, the slide ring. That's so it's adjustable, and then into the top, which will then turn under half an inch and then stitch, or turn under half, turn over 1 inch and then stitch, or a little bit more than 1 inch. We're using a triple stitch here. I probably would use a straight stitch and go to and fro, to and fro, to and fro, so as it's a little bit more secure. But a triple stitch is absolutely fine as well. It looks very, very neat. And there we have our little bunny backpack.
Well, that's the end of our video tutorial on the little bunny backpack. If you'd like to make your own, head on over to our website, swp.com. That is swp.com.